across the street from the White House, close enough that you could read the words on her signs from the north portico. A woman lived in a plastic tent. She was there when Reagan slept inside. She was there when Bush moved in Clinton II. Bush Obama. She outlasted all of them. She was arrested at least 15 times in the first 3 years. Alone she was sentenced to 90 days in jail. She was prosecuted in federal court, the United States government on one side. Homeless Spanish woman with a plastic tent and a sign reading ban all nuclear weapons or have a nice doomsday on the other. She never left for 34 years, 11 months and 25 days, the closest permanent neighbor of the President of the United States was Concepción Picciotto, born in Galicia, Spain. Orphaned young, migrated to New York in 1960. She had a daughter. Once then she didn't, and then she came to Lafayette Square and she stayed, and one of the 5 presidents who lived across the street is recorded to have ever stopped to speak with her. The Guinness World Records certified her Vigil as the longest individual peace protest in human history. They did it 10 days after she died. Her full name was Maria de la Inmaculada Concepción Martínez. Was born January 15, 1936, in Vigo on the Atlantic coast of Galicia, Spain. Her parents died when she was young. Her grandmother raised her. She came to the United States around 1960. She worked in New York as a receptionist, initially for a Spanish government commercial attaché. Lived in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood called Gravesend, which was then, as now, a neighborhood of immigrants who had arrived somewhere and stopped moving. She married an Italian immigrant sometime around 1973. She and her husband adopted an infant daughter from Argentina. They named her Olga. The marriage broke down. What followed was a custody dispute, protracted, documented in its broad outlines, unrecoverable in its specific details. Because no court record from those proceedings has been made public, she fled to Spain. At one point a doctor who examined her there found evidence she had been injected with drugs. She lost the custody case. Olga was removed from her care when the child was a total. Concepción Picciotto did not see her daughter again. She told the Washington Post what happened next. She said, since she could not help her own child, she wanted to do what she could to help other children. In August 1981, she walked to Lafayette Square across the street from the White House, and she joined a peace vigil that had begun 2 months earlier. She brought signs, she brought blankets, she built a shelter out of plastic sheeting, she put on a wig and a chest full of political buttons. She was 45 years old. Photographers who documented her over the following decades describe a small woman, precise in her arrangements, meticulous about her signs, capable of extended conversation about nuclear policy, about scripture, about her own legal cases. She knew the regulations that governed her. She knew the case law, knew the names of the officers who arrested her. What she had lost she had transferred. The vigil became the container for everything the custody case had taken from her. To leave, it was not merely a political decision, it was structurally impossible. She said it herself plainly in 2013 after police dismantled her shelter overnight, and she had to rebuild it from scratch the following afternoon. She said, I was never going to give up. I can't not. I want not. I refuse. 1 year after Concepción Picciotto arrived at Lafayette Square, the Reagan administration moved the Department of the Interior under Secretary James Watt, promulgated a new set of regulations governing demonstrations in the national capital parks. Regulations were codified as 36 CFR 796 G-Day, were framed legally and publicly as content, neutral, time, place, and manner restrictions. They applied on paper to all demonstrators. Equally, the Washington Post reported on these regulations in November 1984. The paper described them as, and this is a direct quotation from the record, a new thicket of regulations drawn up by the Interior Department, enforced by the U.S. Park Police, and recently blessed by the courts, and designed to restrict those who choose the president's doorstep to express their political opinions. Designed, that word is in the contemporaneous newspaper recorded, was not added later. The regulations did 3 specific things. First, demonstrations in Lafayette Park required no permit. But the site had to be continuously occupied. The vigil was unattended for any period, it could be removed. Second, property stored at a demonstration site could not exceed, and this is the legal language that reasonably required, for a 12-hour demonstration blankets, a shelter, cooking materials, changes of clothing, anything that suggested the demonstrator intended to remain longer than a single day, was, by definition, a violation. Third, sleeping, preparing food, or maintaining any form of living accommodation was prohibited, as camping. Think carefully about what this framework. Dos Picciotto's vigil was not a one-day event. It was not a permitted march, was a permanent presence, which is precisely what made it visible, what made it count, what made it the thing the government most wanted. Removed, and the regulations that were enacted specifically in response to the vigil, 1 year after it began, created a structure in which the vigil's permanence was itself the crime. In June 1984, 2 years after the regulations were enacted, 3 years after the vigil began, the United States Supreme Court weighed in. The case was Clark v. Community for Creative Nonviolence. The court upheld the camping ban 7 votes to 2. The majority held it was a valid time, place and manner restriction, constitutionally acceptable. Because it was content neutral, it did not target what Picciotto was saying. It targeted how long she stayed. Justices Marshall and Brennan dissented. They wrote that the ban was a serious infringement on First Amendment rights. They were outvoted. The Supreme Court's ruling provided constitutional shelter for every arrest, every prosecution, every overnight dismantling that would follow across the next 30 years. Legal architecture was now complete. Picciotto was arrested for storing too many blanket sheet, was prosecuted for having too many chairs sheet, was convicted of maintaining a shelter that exceeded what a 24-hour demonstrator required. The United States federal court system processed all of this as an administrative matter, question of property storage, nothing to do with nuclear weapons, nothing to do with what her signs said, nothing at all. 31981. A man named William Thomas begins a peace vigil on the sidewalk beside the White House fences. Signs concern nuclear weapons. He intends to stereogast one. Ijiobayi, Concepción Picciotto, arrives. She will later say she met Thomas on August 12, is 45 years old, and has recently accepted that she will not see her daughter again. The Interior Department issues the new demonstration regulations. Vigil has been in place for 1 year. The regulations are issued. Now, 1982 to 1984, Picciotto is arrested at least 15 times, 15 documented arrests in 36 months. She tells the Washington Post in November 1984, "I believe in the ideals of this country. She is not being ironic." 1984, the Supreme Court rules in Clark v. Camping ban is constitutional. Every future action against the vigil is now legally shelter. Picciotto has been at the vigil for 3 years. She now knows she will fight these regulations for the rest of her life. Fanned, the courts will not save her. 11987A. Park police officer named Brad Hewick arrests Picciotto for violating the storage of property regulation. There is a bench trial. Judge Jackson finds her guilty. Sentence: 10 days suspended, 6 months of unsupervised probation. She returns to the vigil. The D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals upholds the conviction. The court's opinion frames the entire matter as a property regulation question. The First Amendment is not directly addressed. The legal record reflects she had too many blankets, is what the United States government argued on. The Federal Appeals Court agreed. Proposition 1. The nuclear disarmament campaign organized by Picciotto, William Thomas, and Ellen Thomas achieves a ballot initiative in the District of Columbia. The voters of D.C. pass it. This is the vigil's most concrete political achievement. In its first 12 years, the vigil is now 12 years old. Picciotto is 57. She is still there. January 23, 2009. William Thomas Dicey founded the vigil. He is gone. Now Picciotto is the primary guardian. She has been there for 27 years. She does not leave. September 1 to 2013. At approximately 1:45 in the morning, U.S. Park Police arrive at Lafayette Square. The vigil site is unattended. Day volunteer has left their shift. The regulations require continuous occupation. The police dismantled the tent. They remove the signs. They take the chairs by that afternoon. Picciotto and her supporters have rebuilt it, she said to NBC News. Said, first, I felt terrible, but now I see all these people helping to attract attention that we need to stay here. Nevertheless, I was never going to give EP up. Can January 15, 2016, Concepción Picciotto turns 80 years old. Is sleeping partly at the Vigil, partly at N Street Village, a shelter for homeless women. In Washington, D.C. January 2, 52016. She dies at the shelter. She has recently suffered a fall. The immediate cause of death is not confirmed in any public record. She is 80 years old. The Vigil continues. It is still there. January 30202. Guinness World Records certifies her Vigil as the longest individual piece protest in history. 34 years, 177 days. They certified it 8 years after she died. Here is what the official record says happened. The National Park Service and the U.S. Park Police enforced content-neutral regulations governing demonstrations in Lafayette Park. The regulations applied to all demonstrators equally. They prohibited camping, sleeping, food, preparation, and the storage of excess property, not because of what any demonstrator believed, but because Lafayette Square is a public park with rules. Supreme Court of the United States reviewed those rules in 1984 and found them constitutionally sound. Concepción Picciotto was prosecuted for violating those rules. She was found guilty. She appealed. She lost. The system worked as designed now. Here is what the sequence of documented events actually shows. June 1981, a piece. Vigil begins outside the White House. Its message is anti-nuclear. It is the first year of the Reagan administration's nuclear weapons build-up. Lafayette Square is the most photographed public space in Washington. Every news broadcast from the north lawn of the White House has the Vigil in frame or in island. Every visiting head of state passes it. In 1982, 1 year after the Vigil begins, the Interior Department issues new regulations specifically governing demonstrations at Lafayette Square. The regulations are framed as neutral. The Washington Post reports in 1984 that they were designed to restrict those who choose the president's doorstep to express their political opinions. The word used is designed. The regulations do something specific that general park management rules do not do. They create a structural vulnerability unique to permanent vigils. A march cannot be removed because a volunteer missed a shift. A rally cannot be dismantled because someone stored too many chairs. Only a permanent vigil, the exact form the government most needed to remove, is vulnerable to the continuous occupation requirement and the 24-hour property limit. Neutrality of the regulations is real. In one sense, they were applied to all demonstrators. At Lafayette Square, not only to Picciotto, but their design addressed a situation that existed before they were written. The Vigil was already there. The regulations were written after it. The Supreme Court's 1984 ruling accepted the neutral framing. Justices Marshall and Brennan dissented. They wrote that the ban was a serious infringement on First Amendment rights. They were outvoted 5-2. The constitutional shelter that the 7-2 majority provided made all subsequent prosecutions legally untouchable. The documented sequence shows a government that wanted to remove a specific political protest from a specific political location, created regulations that made the protests form its permanence, its continuity, the legal grounds for removal. Message was never the stated reason. The message was always the actual reason. The regulations were the instrument that kept the actual reason out of the courtroom. Picciotto understood this, she said. I believe in the ideals of this country. She did not say the country was living up to those ideals. She said she believed in them. The distinction is precise, and it is in the record. She stayed for 34 years. The regulations are still in place. The Vigil is still there. No NPS official was ever held accountable for any action taken against her. The system worked exactly as designed. There are things the record does not say. The Concepción Picciotto medical records at Bryn Mawr College special collections were restricted until January 1, 2026. That date has passed. The records are, as of this production, technically accessible. No researcher has publicly reported accessing them. What they contain about her health across 35 winters in a plastic tent, about the alleged drug injection in Spain, about the psychiatric assessments that some press accounts allude to, is not in any published source. Some of those press accounts characterized Picciotto as mentally unstable. Paranoid, they noted her belief that she was being persecuted by the government, by institutions, by doctors and nuns who had mistreated Hergevin. What the documented record shows about what the government actually did to her across 35 years. The arrests, the prosecutions, the overnight dismantling, the regulatory architecture designed to remove her. The question of whether her sense of persecution was paranoia or accurate assessment is not straightforwardly answerable. The medical records might clarify this. No one has yet reported what they say. The Washington Post documented 15 arrests in the first 3 years, the total across 35 years, the complete number of arrests, prosecutions, court proceedings, and administrative actions brought against Picciotto and the Vigil has never been compiled in any publicly available document. The NPS and Park Police have never released a comprehensive record. The NPS, internal correspondence, from 1982 to 1984, the period when the demonstration regulations were drafted, has not been systematically requested under the Freedom of Information Act in relation to the Vigil's origins. In a 2024 year action related to the George Floyd protests at Lafayette Square, the Park Police identified 5,000 responsive pages and released 101 heavily redacted. The correspondence about the Vigil's decades-long suppression is, as far as any public record shows, still largely unreleased. Olga Picciotto, adopted in Argentina in 1973, removed from her mother's custody as a toddler, would be approximately 52 years old today. Whether she knew about her mother's 35-year vigil is unknown. Whether she knew her mother died in a homeless shelter is unknown. Whether they were ever reunited is unknown. Record of any contact between them after the custody loss appears in any public source. 5 presidents lived across the street from Concepción Picciotto and Bantlish of them, for periods of up to 8 years, had her tent and her signs in the direct eye line from the north portico. One of them is recorded to have ever stopped to speak with her. None of their published memoirs mentions her by name. She was the closest permanent neighbor any of them had. The archive does not say what any of them thought about the toddler data do. She died on January 25, 2016, in a shelter for homeless women 10 days after her 80th birthday. She had recently suffered a fall. The immediate cause of death was not confirmed in any public record. The Vigil continued. It is still there, now more than 44 years old, maintained by volunteers, the longest continuous peace protest in the history of the United States. The signs still say what her signs said. The tent is still across the street from the White House. The regulations that were used to prosecute her are still in force. Alona Holmes Norton, the District of Columbia's congressional delegate, said in 2013, "We won't ever know what the success is because it doesn't have a specific end of the kind we are used to." She was right. There is no end of the kind we are used to. There is no moment at which the Vigil won and the nuclear threat receded and Picciotto was vindicated by the world. There was only she stayed and then she died and the Vigil continued without Hurley. Karen Stowe, a photojournalist who documented Picciotto's final years, wrote, "There is no evidence to suggest that any one of them, as he rode by in his armored cavalcade, paused to talk with her." 5 presidents, 35 years, no conversation. Picked told the Washington Post why she stayed. She said, "To stop the world from being destroyed." The world has not been destroyed. Nuclear arsenals that her signs protested are still in place, still targeted, still capable of what her signs described. Whether her 34 years and 177 days of presence on that sidewalk contributed to the world's continued existence is not a question. The archive can answer. What the archive says is simpler. A woman came to Lafayette Square in 1981 with a tent and a sign. The government of the United States brought 500 legal actions to remove her. She outlasted 5 presidents to Supreme Court rulings and every regulation the Interior Department could devise. She is still therein. The form of the Vigil she kept. she is still there. That is what the record says.